Domestic policy. The New Freedom domestic policy. The New Freedom was President Woodrow Wilson's plan to reform the economic and political systems in the United States. It focused on reducing the power of large corporations, promoting competition, and protecting small businesses. The policy also included banking reforms and tariff reductions to stimulate economic growth and fairness. The New Freedom was President Woodrow Wilson's response to the growing economic and political challenges of the early 20th century. It aimed to address the dominance of large corporations, which were seen as stifling competition and harming small businesses. By promoting competition and reducing the influence of monopolies, Wilson sought to create a fairer economic environment. Additionally, the policy included banking reforms to stabilize the financial system and tariff reductions to encourage trade and economic growth. These measures were designed to restore balance and fairness in both the economic and political systems of the United States. The New Freedom policy was a comprehensive effort to address economic and political challenges by promoting competition, reducing corporate dominance, and implementing reforms to ensure fairness and growth in the United States. The New Freedom policy was a bold and necessary step to tackle the economic and political challenges of the early 20th century, aiming to restore fairness, encourage competition, and reduce the harmful influence of large corporations on small businesses and the economy. For example, the policy aimed to dismantle monopolistic practices by enforcing antitrust laws, such as the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which prohibited anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions. Additionally, the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 established the Federal Trade Commission to prevent unfair business practices and promote a competitive market environment. However, some critics argue that the New Freedom policy may have had unintended consequences. By targeting large corporations, it could have inadvertently stifled innovation and economic growth. Some believe that the enforcement of antitrust laws might have created unnecessary regulatory burdens, making it harder for businesses to expand and compete. Additionally, the focus on reducing corporate dominance might have overlooked the benefits that larger companies bring, such as job creation and economic stability. Some argue that large corporations, despite their dominance, play a crucial role in driving innovation and economic growth. By enforcing strict antitrust laws, the New Freedom policy might have unintentionally hindered their ability to invest in research and development or expand into new markets. Additionally, larger companies often provide stability in the economy by creating jobs and supporting smaller businesses through supply chains and partnerships, which could have been overlooked in the push to reduce corporate influence. Antitrust laws are regulations designed to promote fair competition by preventing monopolies, price fixing, and other practices that stifle market competition. This is similar to a gardener pulling up weeds to protect a garden, only to realize that some of the weeds were actually beneficial plants that supported the ecosystem. While the intention was to create a healthier environment, the removal of those plants disrupted the balance and potentially limited the garden's overall growth. Thus, while antitrust laws aim to promote fair competition, their unintended consequences can disrupt economic balance and hinder growth. Wilson was a progressive reformer whose domestic agenda, called the New Freedom, aimed to break up monopolies and empower small businesses. Wilson's reforms emerged during the Progressive Era, a time when the United States was grappling with rapid industrialization and the rise of powerful trusts. These trusts, or large business conglomerates, were seen as having too much control over markets and stifling competition. In response, Wilson sought to dismantle these monopolistic entities to create a more equitable economic landscape, empowering small businesses and ensuring consumer protection. Federal Reserve Act 1913 created the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system of the U.S., to provide a more stable and flexible monetary and financial system. This is arguably his most enduring domestic legacy. The Federal Reserve Act was instrumental in modernizing the U.S. financial system by establishing a centralized authority to regulate monetary policy, stabilize currency, and manage economic crises. It marked a significant shift from the previous decentralized banking structure, providing a framework for long-term economic stability and growth. The Federal Reserve Act was a response to the instability of the U.S. banking system, which had suffered from frequent financial panics and economic crises. By creating a centralized authority, the Act aimed to provide a more stable monetary policy and ensure the availability of credit during economic downturns. It also sought to reduce the influence of powerful private banks and create a system that could better manage the nation's money supply, thus fostering long-term economic growth and stability. The Federal Reserve Act was a transformative step toward modernizing the U.S. financial system, ensuring stability and fostering economic growth by centralizing monetary policy and reducing the influence of private banks. For example, the Federal Reserve Act helped mitigate the impact of the Great Depression by enabling the Federal Reserve to take coordinated actions, such as lowering interest rates and providing emergency loans to banks, which stabilized the economy during a period of severe financial turmoil. However, some critics argue that the Federal Reserve Act has not always been effective in stabilizing the economy. They point to instances such as the 2008 financial crisis, where the Federal Reserve's actions were seen as insufficient or even exacerbating the problem. Additionally, some believe that the centralization of monetary policy has led to a lack of accountability and transparency, raising concerns about the potential for misuse of power. This is similar to a captain steering a ship through a storm. While the captain's actions may stabilize the vessel and prevent it from capsizing, critics might argue that the route taken or decisions made during the journey could have been more effective or transparent in ensuring a smoother passage. In summary, while the Federal Reserve Act has played a critical role in stabilizing the economy, its effectiveness and transparency remain subjects of debate. Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, strengthened earlier antitrust laws to curb the power of large corporations and protect labor unions from being treated as monopolies. Labor unions in the early 1900s played a crucial role in advocating for workers' rights and improving labor conditions. They fought for fair wages, reasonable working hours, and safer work environments, often organizing strikes and protests to pressure employers and policymakers. The Clayton Antitrust Act further empowered these unions by ensuring they could not be unfairly targeted as monopolistic entities, thereby supporting their efforts to protect and advance the interests of the working class. The act also sought to prevent anti-competitive practices, such as price discrimination and exclusive dealing that could harm smaller businesses and consumers. By reinforcing the role of labor unions, it helped create a more equitable balance of power between employers and workers, fostering greater economic fairness and stability. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 was pivotal in protecting labor unions and curbing anti-competitive practices, ensuring a fairer balance between workers and employers while promoting economic stability. For example, the Act explicitly stated that labor unions were not to be considered illegal combinations or conspiracies under antitrust laws, allowing them to organize and advocate for workers' rights without fear of legal repercussions. However, some critics argue that the Clayton Antitrust Act did not go far enough in protecting workers' rights. They point out that while the act protected unions from being targeted as monopolies, it did not address other significant issues, such as unequal bargaining power between employers and workers. Furthermore, some believe the act primarily benefited larger unions, leaving smaller or less organized groups without adequate support. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 was a U.S. law designed to strengthen antitrust regulations by prohibiting anti-competitive practices like price discrimination and exclusive dealing. It aimed to protect workers and smaller businesses by exempting labor unions from antitrust laws, enabling them to organize and advocate for better working conditions without legal interference. This is similar to a referee stepping in to ensure fair play in a game. While the referee may prevent certain unfair advantages, they don't always address the underlying disparities that give some players a head start. This is similar to a referee stepping in to ensure fair play in a game. While the referee may prevent certain unfair advantages, they don't always address the underlying disparities that give some players a head start. In conclusion, while the Clayton Antitrust Act aimed to promote fairness and protect workers, Its impact was limited by existing disparities and its focus on larger unions. Federal Trade Commission, 1914, established a government agency to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices. Income tax. The 16th Amendment, ratified just before he took office, allowed Congress to levy an income tax, which Wilson's administration implemented. Child labor laws. Keating-Owen Act, 1916, restricted child labor, though it was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.